We may be about to see yet another withdrawal in the first year of the Trump administration after the U.S. president announced his intention to de-certify the Iran nuclear deal. The foreign minister of Iran criticized the decision, saying that all U.S. long-term commitments could potentially be ended with a change of administration. And President Trump has abandoned his legacies from previous presidents one after another, both domestically and internationally. Will this undermine the U.S. image and its ability to act effectively on the global stage? And what will be the long-term effect if the U.S. fails to honor the deals it signs? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Rong Ying, Vice President of China Institute of International Studies, and Professor James Ray from California State University in Sacramento. We shall also speak to Gamba Nadari, a columnist with Kayhan International newspaper, Iran. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Before we get started, let's take a look at this.
First target was the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. It was created by the Obama administration in 2015, aiming to facilitate trade among its 12 members. But the new U.S. president believed TPP was an unfair deal and pulled out only 3 days after taking office. Believing TPP didn't satisfy Trump's pledge of America First, which means putting U.S. economic and nationalist interests ahead of international commitments. Thus, his focus moved on to the 195-member agreement, the Paris Climate Accord, which deals with tackling greenhouse gas emissions. As leader of the world's second-largest greenhouse gas emitter, Trump claimed the accord will harm American jobs and quit the treaty on June the 1st, leaving the U.S. as one of the only free non-signatories, besides Syria and Nicaragua. Another two deals Trump is threatening to lift is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the Iran nuclear deal framework. The U.S. leader said it will open talks on NAFTA, while asserting the Iran deal is an embarrassment to his country. Besides the political and economical agreements, Washington also announced it will withdraw from UNESCO, accusing it of anti-Israeli bias. This has raised worries the U.S. will unburden itself of further international responsibilities.
Well, let me first go to our Iranian commentator for his latest feedback towards President Trump's decision and not to honor the commitments about the Iran nuclear deal. Now, first of all, we understand the anger of Tehran, but let us know more about your analysis in the broad context of the current trust crisis, as well as how Europeans have first responded to the decision by the White House.
Well, nobody is here happy to see the U.S. leaving the nuclear deal. But the problem is that the Trump White House is going to do just that. They have threatened to do just that. On the other hand, we had so many people here, so many officials here, the government officials, that promised to normalize ties with the U.S., to have the sanctions regime lifted, but none of those things happened. So the promises that President Rouhani made before signing the deal have not been met or delivered yet. So it's bad news for the reformists. The conservatives are happy because they proved beyond any doubt that America is not an international player, a serious player and trustworthy player when it comes to signing important international deals. But at the end of the day, this is bad news, and we have no choice but to get along with it. The good news is that the EU is with us. They are standing by the nuclear deal. Russia, China are doing the same thing. So America alone cannot derail this important deal, and it is only going to isolate itself. At the end of the day, America is also going to prove to North Korea that there is no way they can sort out the differences, the nuclear standoff, through dialogue. North Korea now sees America again as untrustworthy partner, and they will never ever sit down and sort out the differences through dialogue and international deals. But all these things are still speculations, because we know that transatlantic trade volume of the transatlantic trade value between America and EU is huge, and they might.
We understand
have no
your
choice
disillusionment. We understand your anger. We understand the disappointment of Tehran. But what will be the worst case scenario? Do you believe what is happening now is the end game about the Iranian nuclear deal?
Make no mistake, if America tears up the nuclear deal, Iran is going to shred it into pieces. We will only stand by this important deal as long as all parties to the nuclear deal, including the United States, also meet their end of the bargain. If they are trying to game us, they start playing games with us, I'm afraid our leader, our officials here have made it absolutely clear that they will also walk out. That's the end of the story.
I know the worst case scenario will be the walkout. For sure. But let us know more about the nuclear ambition and the capability of the Persian state. Now, to be honest, not all of the observers, to say nothing of the Americans, are fully confident that Iran will be nuclear free. Iran will not go nuclear. Iran will not become a nuclear armed country. Because we all know the escalation of tensions in the Korean Peninsula, where the DPRK is developing its formidable nuclear deterrence, and the United States is, of course, very unhappy. So let us know your true thoughts about the nuclear capability of Iran.
Yeah. The problem is that we have IAEA. And they have made it absolutely clear on several occasions through different reports, again and again, that Iran is sticking to the deal. There has been no diversion with regard to the civilian nature of Iran's nuclear program, especially after signing that important historic deal. So if the intelligence agencies of the United States and Europe, if the IAEA inspectors are telling us, are approving our stance that we haven't diverted, there will be no diversion, I don't see why there is so much fuss about Iran, trying to break free later. We don't have nuclear capabilities to start, building a bomb. And by the way, if we build that bomb, where are we supposed to drop it? Where? Tell us, please. We don't need that bomb, because nuclear power is not going to defend you, help you against foreign aggression. It is your people, it is your economy, it is your political structure within the country, within your own borders, that is going to help you protect yourself from outside threat. And we don't need any, and by the way, we have also signed the NPT. That means that there is no way, even in 100 years, as John Kerry, former Secretary of State, made clear after signing the deal, that Iran is going to divert from the peaceful nature of its nuclear program. I'm afraid these are all just lies and speculations that some Western powers and media outlets are trying to, pose against us. And as I said, if you are still in doubt, you should refer to the numerous reports that IAEA has already published with regard to the civilian nature of Iran's nuclear program. So it's all lies, lies, lies.
Excuse me. President Trump pays an official visit to Tel Aviv, Israel, which is a close friend, if not the closest, I think it's the closest ally of the United States in the Middle East. Israel takes the Persian state of Iran as public enemy #1 because of the track record of your administration to wipe this democracy out from the world map and drive them into the Mediterranean. Now, having said this, there is indeed a trust crisis between Iran and Israel. So when Israel feels it's not very secure, the United States would, of course, feel entitled to a very strong response to whatever nuclear capability that Iran possesses. Now, you have mentioned the nuclear watchdog, IAEA, but is it enough to alleviate the concerns of Tel Aviv?
You see, we have two different parties here in this country, the conservatives, the hardliners, and the reformists. The reformists want dialogue and an interaction with the international community. They don't see any country as enemy #1 of Iran. The problem is the conservatives and the hardliners. They don't like Israel. They want to wipe it off the map. You are right. They are #1 enemy of Israel. But these things, these are just slogans and only for domestic consumption. The problem is that Israel and the United States are taking Iran's threats seriously. But if you ask me, I can tell you with 100% confidence that these are only for domestic consumption. Just as the way that President Trump tries to trump up Iran's so-called nuclear threat to its neighbors, all because he wants to sell weapons and weapons and weapons worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So at the end of the day, it's all about business selling arms to Iran's neighbors. neighbors, scaring them, Iranophobia campaign and stuff like that. But if you hear any threats from Iran with regard to Israel, it's only for domestic consumption. I don't think Iran will ever try to decide and attack Israel under any circumstances, because Israel has nuclear weapons. We don't have nuclear weapons. If we attack Israel, it is going to wipe us off the map. So Israel is a more threat to us than we are to Israel.
Thank you so much. Mr. Rong Ying, what do you think of his confidence, 100% confidence that Iran will not go nuclear in terms of being involved in a nuclear arms race with Israel, which adopts a policy of ambiguity regarding the possession of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I think I'm very happy to have the speakers, statement that despite the frustrations and unhappiness about the certification by the President Trump and the possibility of even terminate that deal, I still made very clear that it would not pursue kind of development nuclear weapons, and also want to see that Iran...
The issue is, Mr. Rong, forgive me for stepping in, so when we have the issue of DPRK nuclear proliferation on our doorsteps in Northeast Asia, is China seriously concerned about having proliferation of a WMD in a remote place like the Middle East?
I think we are.
Why?
Because it has the
implications. The Security Council?
No, more than that. It has the implications, because what we are working with, certainly the Iran nuclear deals, I think we are one of the 6 parties involved, play a very important role. But more importantly, I think the very fact that Iran nuclear deals, I think on the North Korea's nuclear issues, is that it is exactly we are advocating that through negotiation talks we could find a way to solve a problem through negotiations. But with that development, with the decertification of President Trump, now we are losing this argument. That, in other words, the North Korean will argue that even though we agreed to sign the agreement, the President Trump is not going to honor that.
So, James, what's going to happen next in the United States? Do you think Congressmen will likely pass the decertification by President Trump, who is known for the use of tweets, which is not a very serious way of exercising presidential power, right?
I think the bipartisan consensus is that this is the best deal the U.S. is going to have, and I think those in the cabinet within Trump's own team recognize that if we go back to square one and there's no dialogue, the U.S. isn't going to have a good pathway. So I'm fairly confident that the Republicans in Congress will accept this deal and will not move forward with sanctions and not undermine what has taken years to accomplish, to bring China, Russia on board with the Europeans and the Obama administration's strong efforts to accomplish this deal that's really as good as it's going to get.
Then again, Europeans or European allies of the United States will have good reasons to question seriously credibility of the American leadership in the era of a Trump presidency. If you look at one after another, he pulls out of the international commitments. Iran nuclear deal is the latest development. You are watching Dialogue with Rong Ying, James Ray, and our Iranian commentator Gamba Nadari, a columnist with the influential international newspaper in Tehran. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back. A follow-up question for you, Mr. Rong Ying, is can we trust President Donald Trump? Because one after another, he's tearing apart the American commitments. Of course, they were made by the Obama administration, but for years, James, it seems the White House has adopted anything but the predecessor, anything but Bush, anything but Clinton, anything but Obama. Now, if this is a common practice, how can we trust the United States, the consistency of its foreign policy?
Yeah, of course, it is a good question. As you right said, that the new administration would try the best to not overrule, but to put its own sort of policy. Actually, on the previous one, which in the end, more or less, we'll see more continuity. And
but is that the charm and appeal of having a democracy? democracy means a change of leadership, but does it automatically mean the change of mandate, the change of commitment? In that case, if that were to be the case, can we take the American democracy very, very seriously?
Well, I think it does undermine credibility if the incoming administration undermines what is a bipartisan consensus on many issues, particularly on trade. And so I think President Trump has laid out a consistent foreign policy that's against globalization, but that runs against wide sectors of the American populace. And so the NAFTA skepticism, the destruction of TPP, and his hostility to free trade, I think, is more concerning because that's where Republicans have been on board and lured Democrats to that position. Going back on Iran, going back on climate change, goes back to the pre-Obama status quo of typical Republican foreign policy. So it's not so surprising. But I think the time and effort that went in to make a deal with Iran or in the past with North Korea cannot just be thrown away and still rely on American.
But you said earlier, majority of the Republicans are likely to to approve the bill and the suggestion by President Trump. Now, what's behind actually his reluctance? I mean, the defiance and reluctance of President Trump regarding the nuclear deal.
I think partially it's as a candidate, he outlined this as the signature mistake in U.S. foreign policy in historical terms, and he's put his credibility to some extent on the line, and he wants to fulfill his campaign promise. And for him, I think he's now being informed by his closest advisors that this is the really only deal that's feasible. And so I think the hope is that by kicking it to Congress, cooler heads, Bob Corker in Congress, will see it through.
Mr. Royen, I personally feel quite confused as to who President Trump represents. Does he represent white losers in the Rust Belt? Does he only represent Republicans? He's the President of the United States of America. He should represent consensus of the bipartisan political efforts. Now, what we see now is he tears apart the TPP. He wants to pull out of NAFTA. He wants to de-certify the nuclear deal, and he pulls out of the climate change pact that was reached and agreed upon by all the critical players. All the landmark foreign policy breakthroughs of the Obama administration are likely to be thrown away, to be shredded. What do you think of this? I mean, the political consequences here.
Yeah, I hope I have the answer. That it seems that, of course, when he has a problem that is the campaign promises, which I think Professor Ray raised, that which President Trump himself very much concerned about his personal credibility. And then now he's sitting at the White House as the president, which is supposed to be, I mean, representing the interest of the United States, and that is the credibility of a state, of the superpower, I mean, which has the policies have such a big implications and consequences. So I think at least so far the concern is that it seems that he's putting more his personal credibility over the credibility of a country, of a nation that have the policy of which have such a significance. So we hope that there was an answer for that, but that is really we are concerned, and we see the inconsistency, we see the incoherence, and we see kind of a chaos caused by these policy changes, which even for the sake of policy itself, I mean, for the argument, even look at the costs and the risks involved, and talk at the calculations of the pros and cons of change of the policies, we don't have an answer. So that is the problem we are facing. That is, we are concerned.
Do you think the Trump administration is one of domestic politics, period?
No, I think because he's been unable to achieve any of his signature goals domestically, he finds that in foreign policy you have the ability to make deals.
Does it mean that we're going to have a war on our doorsteps because of this the DPRK government that develops the nuclear program, and he threatened to use nuclear bomb against the United States? That is the first bluff an overseas government ever issued to the United States. Do you think, given the domestic woes, economic and political alike, President Trump will divert public attention from the domestic front to the external threats, quote unquote, and we're going to have a war?
I think the risks
because that's your logic, that's your reckoning.
The chances of a military action in the Korean Peninsula are higher than they've ever been because of President Trump Thankfully, his foreign policy team is constraining him. Thankfully, Congress, even in his own party, doesn't want to go down the pathway he's leading, and thankfully, of course, there's an opposition party to constrain. But if left to his own devices, I don't think anybody can predict what he would do, and so I think there is grave concern about his escalation of the rhetoric and then the DPRK's reply to that rhetoric.
Why does President Trump have strong dislikes for multilateral functions, multilateralism, while China, Russia, and the whole of the European Union stand by commitments of the multilateral institutions, the United Nations, for example?
Well, I think that's been a Republican talking point for decades.
Is that the ideology of the Republicans for years?
I think it's an ideology. It plays well in domestic American politics, that we're not listening to international tests, international law.
Are you going to go back to the preemptive strikes as a result?
I don't think so. I think there is, of course, candidate Trump was critical of the wars in Iraq and the intervention potentially in Syria. So I think he's not a warmonger, but I think he's a zero-sum person. It's somebody wins and somebody loses, and he's committed to winning on every issue, and I think that drives his desire to renegotiate trade agreements and even to escalate rhetoric in diplomacy when that's not the place for it.
Let's go back to the issue of a nuclear deal. Do you think prevention of nuclear proliferation remains the top concern for the Trump administration? Since he could not use military intervention easily in Northeast Asia against the DPRK to really translate into reality the threat of brinksmanship. I mean, that's indeed something major. If a nuclear warfare were to break out, that means millions of people in Northeast Asia are likely to be killed.
I think it should be, and it must be. As we all know very well, I think President Trump himself knows very well that there's no military solution to the issue, particularly, I mean, the nuclear issue, particularly on the Korean Peninsula. The problem is that I think the way I mean, the tactics adopted, that by putting or threatening or even pressure on North Korea, and for the sake, I don't know, possibly for the sake that they would have a better position, I mean, for negotiation, is very dangerous and cause a lot of concern. As we all know, there could be miscalculation, there could be missing understanding of that. And besides, I think the North Korean, being a weaker party, has very much, I think, worried and had no confidence, at least so far, even as we discussed, that even a deal I mean, can be overruled, it can be terminated. So I think looking in this context, we really need a consistent and coherent sort of policy or message, which I hope that President Trump would be able to do. That would very much help the issue of nuclear non-proliferation, but more importantly, I think it will help, I think, countries in the region, China included, to achieve peace and stability.
If we are to take a broad look or examine the issue of Iran nuclear deal in a broad context, then that's next question is, what is the strategy of the Trump administration about the Middle East? President Trump visited Riyadh, promising to sell weapons and arms in millions worth of dollars, weapons worth of millions of dollars. Now, does it mean that he's going to adopt a different scenario, nipping the Persian state's influence in the bud, supporting Riyadh, and realigning itself with pro-American forces geopolitically in the broad region of the Middle East?
Well, I do think the Saudis like hearing this. I think some other Gulf states are supportive of this. And of course, the Bush administration's removal of the government in Iraq, not to say Afghanistan, gave entree to Iran to have dominance in Iraq, to be propping up the regime in Syria, to allow Hamas to become elected in the West, in Gaza. So I think the traditional reliance between the U.S. and Saudis on security, balance of power to keep Iran constrained is reasserting itself. So that gives some hope that this is part of a strategy that I think is not the right strategy, because I think we need to be in dialogue with Iran and not totally on the side of the Saudis, but at least it is a convention of American foreign policy thinking.
And do you believe, James, that this nuclear deal decertification is part of a broad conspiracy theory? In fact, Iran is the pawn in the big game. If you look at the newly emerging axis composed of Russia, Turkey, Iran against the United States in the Middle East, that quickly emerges from the civil strife of Syria. And Iran promises to support Russia. So do you think Tehran is being used as a pawn?
Well, I think there's the strategic thinking for the U.S., but I think the historical memory of the 1979 occupation of the U.S. Embassy, for somebody like Trump, is part of, and in his speech he went back to those time frame and those memories. And then I think it's a very American way of thinking that we want a short-term solution that finalizes and removes this problem for history and we can claim victory. But dialogue and negotiation, diplomacy don't have this finality. So I think there's always, particularly in the Republican constituency, a belief that you can win in this man-to-man confrontation.
When we go back to the origin of the problem, so we see today concerning nuclear deal and the nuclear ambition of Iran, perhaps it is the United States which should take the first blame. Look at the ouster of Saddam Hussein, which was used and had been used by CIA and the American government to serve as a counterweight against the rise of Persian state. Look at the Iran-Iraq war. Who had been so supportive of Baghdad? Russia, the United States, and even China, right, during the Iran-Iraq war. Now, with the decapitation of Saddam Hussein, right, and with the Shiite coalition between Iran and Iraq, we have the growing influence of Iran. And geopolitically, the Trump administration starts to roll back what the U.S. has achieved. What do you think of the ramifications?
Yeah, exactly. We have to be really careful and really watch about the implications of this move, which I think could be a starting point of renewed of that strategy of isolating or even containing Iran, which is a very important regional player. For me, I think the nuclear deal, we had 2005 signifies a kind of agreement among major powers. That is, say that helping Iran, particularly these reformists, to open up to the outside world by, keeping a close monitoring of nuclear programs is the viable and effective way of solving the problem.
The United States is paying a price because the leadership of this superpower is being called into question by the rest of the world. And the Iran nuclear deal is just the latest development in this general and broad context. We're going to continue our discussion about the credibility of American leadership during the era of the Trump administration. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.